The transmission came in at 3 in the morning, station time, and it changed everything. I was sitting in the observation gallery of the Galactic Council chambers, the same gallery I had occupied for 9 years straight, when my earpiece crackled with a frequency that no one on this station should have been able to detect. It was Geneva, direct line, no relay. The message was 4 words long. They filed the motion. I set my tea down on the narrow shelf beside my chair and stared through the glass partition that separated me from the main council floor below. 312 species, 4,000 delegates. And me, sitting up here like a museum exhibit behind a pane of transparent barrier, watching them decide the fate of worlds I would never be invited to speak about. My name is Daniel Shaw. I am, according to my official title, the passive observer and cultural attaché of Earth to the Galactic Council. That title is a polite way of saying I am the man they let sit in the room but never allowed to talk. I have no vote. I have no speaking privileges. I have a chair, a translation feed, and a view. That is what 47 years of silence bought humanity in the eyes of the galaxy. I should explain how we got here, because the galaxy has a very different version of this story than the one I lived through. Their version goes something like this. In the year 2031, a Draven hegemony survey vessel detected radio signals from a small yellow star on the outer edge of the Orion Arm. They followed the signals. They found Earth. They made contact. And the species they found, us, looked up at the stars, received the greatest revelation in the history of our civilization, and then did something no contacted species had ever done before. Not immediately, of course. There were conversations. There were early exchanges. A small diplomatic channel was opened, and the Galactic Council, in what they considered an act of extraordinary generosity, offered humanity provisional membership, access to trade routes, technology transfers, educational programs, the full welcome package that every new species received when they were brought into the fold. Earth declined. All of it. We sent a single diplomat to the council station, accepted no technology, signed no treaties, joined no alliances, and then went quiet. The galaxy decided this meant we were afraid, primitive, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of what we had encountered. They pitied us for a while, then they forgot about us. And forgetting us was the most dangerous thing they ever did. I arrived on Vithari Prime 9 years ago, as Earth's fourth passive observer. The three before me had each served their rotation, filed their reports, and returned home, without ever once raising their voice in a council session. That was the job. Watch. Listen. Learn. Report. Because the thing about sitting behind glass while alien species discuss your homeworld is that you hear everything. You hear the Draven senior commandant, a towering figure named Torvok Sen, refer to humans as grass-eaters during a trade debate, and the chamber laughs. You hear the Oravan Concord, those elegant insectoid intellectuals who believe they are the galaxy's teachers, propose an educational uplift program for Earth. Essentially a remedial course for a species they consider barely above animals, and you watch the delegates nod in solemn agreement. You hear smaller species, ones who joined the council centuries ago and have long since forgotten what it felt like to be new, make jokes about the silent humans who sit in the back and contribute nothing. You hear all of it, and you sit there, and you drink your tea, and you write it down. The Draven were the worst. Their hegemony controlled roughly 40% of known space, and they had built that empire the old-fashioned way, through expansion, through pressure, through the understanding that the universe belonged to those strong enough to claim it. Torvok Sen was their voice on the council, and he had the kind of presence that made other delegates shrink in their seats. He was enormous, even by Draven standards, with a voice that resonated through the chamber like something geological. He had made it clear on multiple occasions that he considered humanity a waste of a perfectly good star system. The Oravan were different but not better. They were ancient, possibly the oldest civilization still active in the galaxy, and they wore that age like a crown. Their representative, a slender being named Counselor Yethus, spoke to me once in the corridor outside the gallery. She tilted her head, examined me with compound eyes that refracted the light into 1,000 tiny versions of my own face, and said, "Your species has potential, Observer Shaw. It is a shame you lack the guidance to realize it. Perhaps one day you will accept our help." I thanked her. I went back to my chair. I filed a report. The third major power was the Veli Communion, and they were the ones that made me uneasy. The Veli were a hive-mind fungal network, a single consciousness distributed across billions of individual nodes. They rarely spoke in sessions. They voted in blocks. And they watched everything with a patience that reminded me uncomfortably of my own. Once, during a long session on resource allocation, I caught their representative, a pale, motionless figure, seated at the far end of the chamber, staring directly at me. Not at the proceedings, at me. When I met the gaze, the figure simply tilted its head, held the stare for a long moment, and then looked away. They sensed something, I was sure of it. But they never said a word. My days on Vithari Prime followed a routine that I had perfected over 9 years. I attended every open session. I reviewed every published resolution. I monitored every public communication channel the council broadcast on. And every evening, I sat in my small quarters, a single room with a bed, a desk, and a window that looked out on the docking ring, and I transmitted my reports to Geneva through a device that looked like a simple wristband, but operated on principles that no species on this station had ever encountered. No one ever asked about the wristband. No one ever asked how I communicated with Earth. No one ever scanned my quarters, examined my belongings, or questioned how a supposedly primitive species managed to keep a diplomat alive and functioning on a station 400 light-years from home for nearly a decade. They assumed we were using the basic communication relay the Council had provided during first contact. We were not. The thing about being invisible is that people stop performing around you. They stop being careful. Delegates would have conversations in the corridors as I walked past, speaking freely because the human in the plain gray suit was simply part of the furniture. I heard things. I learned things. I understood the political currents of this galaxy in ways that most junior delegates never would, because they were too busy talking to listen, and I had been trained to do nothing but listen. My predecessor, a woman named Lucy Grant, had served 12 years before me. She filed over 11,000 technical reports during her tenure. 11,000 documents covering everything from Draven military doctrine to Orevan computational theory to the navigational architecture of Council trade routes. She never spoke a word in a session. She never attended a single social function. She simply watched, and she wrote. And when her rotation ended, she went home and briefed a room full of people whose titles I was not cleared to know. I often wondered what she thought about during those 12 years. Whether the contempt wore her down the way it sometimes wore me down. Whether she ever sat in the gallery and wanted to stand up and say something, anything, just to see the look on their faces when the silent human opened its mouth. But that was not the job. The job was patience. And patience, as I had been told during my training, was humanity's oldest and most dangerous weapon. On the morning the transmission came in, I already knew what the motion would contain. I had been tracking the Draven hegemony's internal communications for months, not through any channel the Council would have approved, and I had watched the resolution take shape like a storm building on a horizon. Resolution 4-187, a formal motion to reclassify Sol System as an underdeveloped resource zone. Under galactic law, an underdeveloped resource zone was a system whose primary inhabitants had failed to demonstrate sufficient technological or economic development to justify exclusive territorial claim. Any council member could petition for extraction rights to non-inhabited bodies in such a system. Moons, asteroids, gas giants, everything that was not the homeworld itself. They wanted Jupiter's hydrogen, Saturn's rings, the metals in our asteroid belt. They wanted to strip our solar system to the frame and leave us sitting on Earth like children in an empty room, wondering where all the furniture went. And the worst part was that it was legal. Under the laws that humanity had never agreed to, never signed, and never been given a vote on, it was perfectly, procedurally legal. I finished my tea, I composed myself, and then I did something I had not done in 9 years of service. I filed a formal objection. The response from the Council was exactly what I expected. The objection was received, noted, logged, and set aside for committee review, which in Council terms meant it would be buried in procedural delays until the resolution passed. The notification I received was polite and brief. The Council thanks Earth's passive observer for the submission. The matter will be reviewed in due course. I contacted Geneva. I used the wristband, not the Council relay. I described the situation in precise terms. The motion, the timeline, the legal framework, the fact that the Draven clearly had the votes to push it through. Geneva's response came back in under a minute. Noted. Continue observing. I sat with that for a long time. Continue observing. The same instruction every observer had received for 47 years. Watch, listen, report, do not engage. I understood the strategy. I believed in the strategy. But understanding and believing did not make it easy, because out there beyond the glass, Torvok Sen was laughing, and the galaxy was laughing with him, and somewhere in the space between here and home, a species of 8 billion people was being treated like an inconvenience on someone else's map. I poured another cup of tea. I sat back in my chair, and I continued observing. But something had shifted. I could feel it, in the quality of the silence that came back from Geneva. Something in the brevity of the response. Something in the speed of it. 1 minute. They had answered in 1 minute. In 9 years, the fastest response I had ever received was 4 hours. Someone was awake back home. Someone was watching this in real time, and they had been waiting for it. That night, I stood at the window of my quarters and looked out at the docking ring. Ships from 100 worlds came and went, their running lights tracing patterns against the black. Somewhere out there, past the edge of council space, past the trade routes and the relay stations, and the borders that these species had drawn across the stars like fences across a field, Earth was turning. 8 billion people were waking up, going to work, raising their children, living their lives under a sun that the Draven hegemony had just filed paperwork to claim. They did not know about the motion yet. They would, soon enough. But what they did know, what every person on Earth understood in some quiet, fundamental way, was that humanity had been watching the stars for a very long time, longer than any species on this station realized. And we had been learning. I touched the wristband on my wrist, the device that no council species had ever asked about, the one that communicated through a method their physics said should not be possible for another 300 years. Patience, they told me during training. Patience is not the absence of action. It is the discipline to act only when the action will be final. I turned off the light. I lay down on my narrow bed, and for the first time in 9 years, I did not sleep. Something was coming. I could feel it the way you feel. A change in pressure before a storm. Earth had said continue observing. But the way they said it, the speed, the certainty, the absence of any follow-up question, told me something that no transmission ever had. They were ready. The weeks that followed the filing of Resolution 4-1187 moved with the slow, grinding inevitability of a machine that had been designed to produce only one outcome. Torvok Sen presented the motion to the full council on a morning when the chamber was packed to capacity. I watched from the gallery as he stood at the central podium, his massive frame casting a shadow across the speaking floor, and laid out his case with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you have already won. The Sol system, he said, his voice filling every corner of the chamber, contains resources of extraordinary value. Hydrogen reserves, in the gas giant designated Jupiter alone, could fuel hegemony operations for 3 centuries. The asteroid belt contains rare metals that 6 council species have identified as critical to their industrial development, and yet these resources remain untouched, unused, wasted by a species that has demonstrated neither the capacity nor the ambition to develop them. He paused. He looked up at the gallery, directly at me. We do not propose this out of hostility toward our human neighbors. We propose it out of responsibility to the galaxy. Resources cannot be left idle when civilizations have need. The chamber murmured in agreement. I sat still. My hands were steady, my face showed nothing. The vote to move the resolution to formal committee passed with 83% support. I had heard that term exactly twice in my career. Once during my initial briefing, when a woman whose name I was never given told me that my role as observer existed within a larger framework that had been in motion since before I was born, and now, in a 40-second transmission, dropped into the conversation like it was nothing. I did not ask what Phase 4 was. I was not supposed to know. but the fact that Geneva had mentioned it at all told me something important. Possibly closer. The weeks ground forward. The Draven moved with efficient precision. Survey ships entered the outer boundaries of our solar system, 6 of them, running preliminary scans on Jupiter's atmosphere and the composition of the asteroid belt. Earth's ground-based observatories detected them, or at least that is what the Council believed. The Draven reported no resistance, no communication, no response of any kind from the human homeworld. They do not even have the capability to reach their own outer planets, Torvak Sen remarked during a session, and we are debating whether they deserve to keep them. The laughter was louder this time. She sat across from me in a small conference room, her compound eyes catching the light, and presented what she called a partnership framework. Earth would retain sovereignty over its homeworld, she said, her translator rendering her clicking speech into smooth, measured English. But the development of your system's resources would be managed by a joint Orevan human commission. We would provide the technology, the expertise, the infrastructure. You would provide access. In return, Earth would receive a share of the extracted resources and the benefit of our guidance. She leaned forward slightly. This is a generous offer, Observer Shaw. More generous than you will receive from the Draven. I encourage you to consider it carefully. I considered the careful, patient condescension in her voice, the way she spoke to me like a teacher explaining long division to a struggling student. I will relay your proposal to my government, I said. I relayed the proposal. Geneva's answer was 3 words. Decline. Stay focused. 3 more species approached me that week. 2 of them offered variations of the Orevan deal, partnerships that amounted to colonial management with a polite label. The third, a small avian species called the Cathali, simply told me they were sorry. We were in your position once, their ambassador said, a slight creature with iridescent feathers and sad, knowing eyes. 800 years ago, the Draven filed the same kind of motion against our system. We fought it through legal channels. We lost. They took our outer moons. We never recovered them. I would have been less polite about it. Most of them framed it as a story of waste, a primitive species sitting on a fortune it could not use. Several commentators suggested that Earth should be grateful for the attention, that the development of our system would bring benefits we could never achieve on our own. One broadcast, produced by a Draven media outlet, included a segment where a panel of alien academics discussed humanity's potential with the same tone you might use to discuss a particularly slow animal. Fascinating tool use, one of them said. Remarkably advanced for a species at their stage, but they have clearly reached their developmental ceiling. I thought about Lucy Grant and the 11,000 reports. I thought about the 3 observers before her and the reports they had filed. I thought about 47 years of watching and listening and writing things down while the galaxy patted us on the head and told us we were cute. And then, something happened that changed everything. The MV Helios Dawn, a civilian transport vessel carrying 2,200 passengers, had been intercepted in the Proxima Corridor by a Draven patrol frigate. The ship was en route to a destination that the Council did not know existed, a human colony. One of 14 that Earth had quietly established beyond its home system over the past 3 decades, without filing a single settlement claim, without requesting a single permit, without telling a single soul on the Galactic Council. The Draven frigate had detained the Helios Dawn under authority of Council navigation statutes. The passengers were being held for what the patrol commander called customs processing. Families were being separated for biological screening. Children were being taken from their parents and placed in isolation compartments on the frigate. 2,200 civilians, held in the corridor between stars by a species that thought we were too primitive to notice. I read the report twice. My hands were not steady anymore. 9 years of tea and silence and carefully filed reports. I had watched them laugh at us. I had listened to them discuss our solar system like unclaimed real estate. I had smiled politely, while they called us grass eaters and offered to teach us how to think. But this was different. This was not politics. This was not procedure. This was children being pulled from their parents' arms by a species that considered them barely more than animals. I composed a transmission to Geneva. It was not a report. It was not an observation. It was a single sentence, sent on the priority channel, encrypted with protocols that the Council's best analysts could not have cracked in 1,000 years. They have touched civilians. The response came back in 11 seconds, not from Geneva, from somewhere deeper. Somewhere I was not supposed to know about. The message was unsigned, unattributed, and absolutely clear. We know. Stand by for formal communication. The Council will hear from Earth within the hour. I stood at the window. My reflection stared back at me, pale and sharp against the black of space. Beyond the glass, the station hummed with the ordinary business of a galaxy that did not yet understand what it had done. 47 years. We had given them 47 years of silence, 47 years of patience, 47 years of watching and learning, and choosing, every single day, not to speak. They had mistaken that silence for weakness, for fear, for the quiet submission of a species that knew its place. They were about to learn what it actually was. The formal communication arrived on every diplomatic channel simultaneously. It was addressed to the full Galactic Council, transmitted in all 312 member languages, formatted according to Council protocol that humanity was not supposed to know, and stamped with an authentication code that the Council's own verification systems confirmed as genuine. It contained one sentence. Humanity requests the floor. The Council chamber erupted. Not in alarm, in delight. The silent species was finally going to speak. After 47 years, the humans were going to open their mouths, and every delegate in the building wanted a front row seat for what they assumed would be either a surrender or a plea. I stood in the gallery and watched them buzz with excitement. I watched Torvak Sen lean back in his seat with a grin that showed rows of teeth. I watched Councillor Yethis turn to her aide and say something that my translation feed rendered as, "At last. Perhaps now they will accept reason." I watched the Valley representative sit perfectly still and stare at me again with that same unreadable expression. The council speaker, an elderly being from a species I had never bothered to learn the name of, announced that Earth's request would be granted. A speaking session would be convened in 3 days. Humanity's passive observer would be permitted to address the full council from the central podium. 3 days. I had 3 days to prepare for the most important moment in the history of human civilization. I went back to my quarters. I sat at my desk, and for the first time in 9 years, I did not file a report. Instead, I opened a file that had been stored on my wristband since the day I arrived on Vithari Prime. A file I had been instructed never to open unless I received a specific authorization code. The code had arrived embedded in Geneva's transmission, hidden in the authentication stamp that the council had verified without realizing what else it contained. I opened the file. I read it, and then I sat very still for a very long time. It was the speech, not the framework for a speech, not talking points or suggestions. The speech, every word, every pause, every deliberate silence. It had been written years before I ever set foot on this station. It had been refined, revised, and perfected by people whose names I would never know, people who had spent their careers preparing for this exact moment. And as I read it, I understood for the first time the full scope of what Earth had been doing for the last 47 years, the full depth of the silence, the full weight of the patience. I understood, and the understanding hit me like a physical force, because the speech did not contain threats, it did not contain demands, it did not contain anger or resentment, or any of the things I had been carrying behind my quiet face for 9 years. It contained facts, just facts, clean, precise, and absolutely devastating. I read it 3 more times. I practiced it once, standing alone in my quarters, speaking to the empty room, and then I put on the uniform that had been packed at the bottom of my storage case since the day I arrived. Black fabric, simple cut, no decoration except a single emblem on the chest, Earth. our pale blue world, rendered in silver thread, surrounded not by laurels or shields but by stars. I looked at myself in the narrow mirror by the door. I barely recognized the man staring back, not because I had changed, but because for the first time in 9 years, I was not hiding. The 3 days passed like a held breath. The morning of the address, the council chamber was full beyond capacity. Delegates had requested additional seating. Observers from non-member species had applied for temporary gallery access. The media channels were carrying the session live to every corner of the galaxy. The silent species was going to speak, and everyone wanted to hear what sound it would make. I stood in the observation gallery, behind the glass partition, and waited. The council speaker called the session to order. The chamber settled, and then the speaker said the words that no human had ever heard directed at them in this room. The floor recognizes the representative of Earth. A mechanism I had never seen activated hummed to life. The glass partition in front of my chair slid open, not a door opening in the glass. The glass itself retracted into the walls, dissolving the barrier that had separated me from the council floor for 9 years. Open air, nothing between me and them. I stood. The chamber was watching. 4,000 delegates, 312 species. Every eye, every sensor, every perceptual organ in the room turned toward the human in the black uniform standing in the gallery, where no human had ever stood without glass in front of them. The walk from the gallery to the central podium was 200 meters. I had measured it years ago, during a quiet session, when the chamber was nearly empty. I had walked the route in my mind 1,000 times. I knew every step. I descended the gallery stairs. My boots were the only sound in the chamber. The acoustics of the room, designed to carry the voices of species from across the galaxy, carried each footstep like a heartbeat. I passed the Orovon section, where Counselor Yethis sat with her hands folded, her compound eyes tracking my movement with mathematical precision. I passed the Draven block, where Torvak Sen sat in his oversized chair, arms crossed, watching me with the amused patience of someone waiting for entertainment. And I passed the Vayli representative, that pale, motionless figure at the far end of the chamber. As I walked by, the figure did something I had never seen a Vayli do in 9 years. It stood up. Not in challenge, not in protest. It simply rose to its feet as I passed, like a gesture of something I could not name, and then it sat back down. I reached the podium. I placed my hands on the speaking surface. I looked out at the chamber. The silence was so complete I could hear the environmental systems cycling air through the ventilation ducts. I began. 47 years ago, you found us. My voice, fed through the chamber's translation system, emerged in 312 languages simultaneously. I could hear the echoes layering on top of each other, a strange harmony of alien phonemes, all carrying the same words. You came to our star, you made contact, you offered us a place in your galaxy, and then, when we chose not to speak, you stopped wondering why. I let the silence hang for 3 seconds. Exactly 3 seconds. The speech was precise about these things. You assumed our silence meant fear, confusion, the overwhelmed quiet of a species confronting something too vast to comprehend. And because you assumed, you never asked. You never investigated. You never once considered the possibility that our silence was not a failure of capability, but a choice. I looked at Torvak Sen. His amusement had not faded, but something behind it had shifted. A flicker of uncertainty, barely visible, like a shadow passing behind glass. And I would like honest answers, not because the answers matter to me, but because I want you to hear them out loud. Silence. No, I answered for them. You did not. You scanned the surface. You cataloged our cities, our agriculture, our transportation networks. I moved to the next question. Did anyone investigate the communication device carried by Earth's passive observer? I held up my wrist. The wristband caught the light. This device has been in plain sight for 47 years. 4 observers have worn it. It operates on a quantum entanglement principle that, according to your own published physics, should not be achievable by any civilization below a Class 7 technological index. Earth is rated Class 3. The murmur that went through the chamber was not amusement. It was something else. Did the Orevan Concord analyze the linguistic patterns in my predecessor's communications and wonder how a Class 3 species achieved native fluency in 9 council languages within 2 years of first contact, without any educational assistance? Counselor Yethis did not move, but I saw her aide lean over and whisper something urgent. Did the Draven Hegemony's survey ships in our solar system notice a navigational drift of 0.003% during their scanning runs? Consistent, repeatable, across all 6 vessels? Torvoksen's arms uncrossed. That drift, I said, is consistent with tracking by a gravitational lens array, a technology that, according to your own theoretical models, should not exist for another 3 centuries. Those survey ships were being watched from the moment they entered our system. Their positions, their headings, their communication frequencies, and the content of their transmissions were logged in real time by a monitoring network that has been operational for over 20 years. The chamber was no longer murmuring. It was silent. With the Council's permission, I would like to show you what humanity has been doing for the last 47 years. The lights dimmed, and I began. The first image appeared above the podium in the Council's holographic display system, projected through hardware that the station's engineers controlled, but using a data feed from my wristband that they absolutely did not. It was a star chart, the galaxy, rendered in extraordinary detail, with every gravitational corridor, every mass shadow, every dark matter filament mapped and labeled in precise notation. Compiled over 11,000 years by the combined survey efforts of every member species, it covers approximately 61% of the galaxy's gravitational architecture. The new chart filled the same space, but it was different, denser, more complete. Regions of the galaxy that appeared as blank space on the Council's version were filled with structure, with corridors and junctions and gravitational nodes that no Council survey had ever reached. This is Earth's chart, I said, compiled over 43 years by a division of our government called the Listener Corps. It covers 97.3% of the galaxy's gravitational architecture. The Orovon delegation rose to their feet, not in protest, in shock. Counselor Yethis stood motionless, her compound eyes fixed on the display, and for the first time in my 9 years on this station, I saw an expression on her face that I could read without any translator. She was afraid. We did not build this chart through exploration, I continued. We built it through listening. Your ships generate gravitational signatures when they travel. Your relay stations emit patterns. Your communication networks create interference maps. For 43 years, we have been collecting that data, analyzing it, and assembling a picture of the galaxy that is, by a significant margin, more complete than anything this council possesses. I let that settle. Then I moved to the next layer. The council believes that humanity has no faster-than-light capability. This is incorrect. A new display, technical specifications, rendered in notation, that combined human mathematics with council standard formats, because we had learned their notation decades ago. Earth developed functional FTL travel in 2049, 18 years after first contact. We did not reverse engineer your drives. We observed the subspace distortion patterns created by council vessels entering and leaving our system, derived the underlying physics from those observations, and then developed our own approach. I paused. This was the important part. Our approach is different from yours. Council FTL technology relies on established subspace corridors, fixed routes through the galaxy's gravitational architecture. Our drives do not. We travel through what your physicists call deep subspace, a layer your theoretical models predicted, but classified as inaccessible. Your models were wrong. I changed the display again. 14 points of light appeared on the star chart. 14 locations scattered across a region of space that the Council considered empty wilderness, unexplored and unoccupied. These are human colony worlds, I said. 14 settlements, established over the past 31 years, with a combined population of approximately 400,000 people. They were founded without Council permits, without settlement claims, and without detection. The Helios Dawn, the civilian transport currently being detained by a Draven patrol frigate, was en route to the 15th. The silence in the chamber had changed quality. It was no longer the silence of attention. It was the silence of a room full of predators who had just discovered that the small, quiet animal in the corner was not what they thought it was. Torvok Sen was staring at the display. His expression was unreadable, but his body language was not. He had gone still in the way that large, dangerous creatures go still when they encounter something they do not understand. I moved to the final layer, the one that would change everything. 22 years ago, I said, Earth deployed a network of observation vessels into Council space. Small ships, uncrewed, powered by systems that your sensor technology cannot detect, because they operate on principles your physics has not yet described. New data appeared on the display: coordinates, dates, sensor logs. These vessels have been present in every major council system for over 2 decades. They have observed your military exercises. They have monitored your diplomatic communications. They have recorded your scientific research, your trade negotiations, your internal political debates, and your private conversations. I looked directly at Torvak Sen. I have the complete sensor logs from a Draven military planning session held 7 months ago in the Sen Citadel on your homeworld. The session was classified at the highest level of hegemony security. There were 9 people in the room. I can name all of them. I can tell you what they discussed word for word. Sen did not move, but something changed in his eyes, something that had never been there before when he looked at a human. We never interfered, I said, turning back to the full chamber. We never used what we learned for strategic advantage. We never sold intelligence. We never manipulated outcomes. We watched because we wanted to understand who you were before we decided who we would be. I paused. I let the silence fill the space between the words. Everything I have shown you today was built in peacetime, by a species that chose patience over confrontation and observation over conflict. This is what we accomplished when we were curious, when we were interested, when we had no reason to be anything other than calm. I placed my hands flat on the podium. I will leave it to this council to consider what we might accomplish if you give us a reason to be something else. The chamber was carved from silence. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The holographic display continued to rotate above the podium, showing humanity's star chart with its 14 colony worlds and its network of invisible watchers spread across a galaxy that had never once thought to look over its shoulder. I was not finished. There is one more matter, I said. The MV Helios Dawn. 2,200 passengers, including 341 children, are currently being held by a Draven patrol frigate, under authority that was never legitimate, and is now, I believe, clearly understood to be inadvisable. I looked at Torvak Sen one final time. You have 12 hours to return them, all of them, unharmed. After that, we will collect them ourselves, and I want to be very clear about what I mean by that. We will not file a motion. We will not submit an objection. We will not request a committee review. We will come and get our people, and there will be nothing procedural about it. I gathered the small folder of notes I had placed on the podium, though I had not looked at them once. I straightened my uniform, and I walked back up the stairs, past the Draven delegation, past the Orevan section, past the Vayli representative who was still standing, past all of them. I returned to my chair in the gallery. I sat down. The glass partition remained open. No one thought to close it. I poured myself a cup of tea, and I waited. The 12 hours were not necessary. The Helios Dawn was released in 7. The communication came through on a public diplomatic channel, broadcast to the full council and every media outlet in the galaxy. The Draven hegemony formally acknowledged that the detention of the human transport vessel had been conducted in error. The passengers were being returned to their original heading without condition. The patrol frigate was withdrawing from the Proxima corridor. The word they used was error, not a correction, not a policy change. An error. As though the entire incident had been a clerical mistake, a misunderstanding, something that happened by accident rather than by design. I sat in my chair and read the communication, and understood what it actually was. It was the first formal apology the Draven hegemony had issued in 900 years. They had wrapped it in the language of bureaucratic correction because they could not bring themselves to say the word sorry, but the meaning was clear to every species that heard it. The Draven had blinked, and the galaxy had watched them do it. The aftermath moved quickly. Resolution 4-1187, the motion to reclassify Sol system, was withdrawn within 48 hours. Not voted down, not tabled. Withdrawn by its own sponsors, who suddenly discovered that they had more pressing legislative priorities, and that the resource question could be revisited at a later date that everyone understood would never arrive. The Orevan Concord quietly shelved their partnership framework. Councillor Yethis did not request another meeting with me. In fact, she did not look at me at all during the next 3 sessions. Her compound eyes, which had tracked me with such patient condescension for 9 years, now focused very deliberately on anything else in the room. But the real aftermath was happening in the corridors, in the private channels, in the diplomatic back rooms where the actual business of the galaxy was conducted. And it was not what I expected. I expected fear. I expected hostility. I expected the Draven to rally the military powers against Earth, to frame humanity as a covert threat that had been spying on sovereign civilizations for decades. Torvok Sen had every political incentive to do exactly that, and he did. Within 72 hours of my address, he had begun reaching out to other military-aligned species, proposing a defensive coalition against what he called the human infiltration. He called for an emergency session. He stood at the same podium I had stood at and delivered a speech about sovereignty, about the sacred right of civilizations to conduct their affairs without being watched by invisible spies, about the danger of allowing a silent, deceptive species to sit among them while maintaining hidden capabilities that exceeded the Council's own. It was a good speech. It should have worked. He had spent 9 centuries building a reputation for military dominance, and that reputation should have carried weight. It did not. The motion for a defensive coalition went to vote, and it failed. Not narrowly, catastrophically. Of 312 member species, only 14 voted in favor. 261 voted against. The remaining 37 abstained. The Draven hegemony had never lost a major vote by that margin, not once in their 1,000-year membership. Torvok Sen stood at the podium and watched the tally appear on the display above him, and I saw something cross his face that I had never seen on a Draven before. Not anger, not defiance, embarrassment. The decisive votes came from the Veli Communion. The hive-mind fungal network had been silent throughout the entire crisis, voting in their enormous block without comment, without explanation, without any public statement of their position. When their votes were cast against the coalition, the chamber went still. And then the Veli representative spoke. In 9 years, I had heard a Veli speak exactly 4 times. They communicated internally through their network, a shared consciousness that had no need for words. When they did speak aloud, it was significant. When they spoke to the full council, it was historic. We have tasted the silence of many species, the Veli said. In our long existence, we have learned to read what silence contains. The silence of fear has a quality. The silence of emptiness has a quality. The silence of contempt has a quality. Each is distinct. The representative paused. The chamber waited. Humanity's silence tasted of none of these. For 47 years we observed it. We analyzed it. We searched for the patterns that would tell us what it meant. And we found something that we had not encountered in 11,000 years of membership in this council. Another pause. Humanity's silence tasted of patience. Not passive patience. Not the patience of a species waiting for permission. The patience of a species choosing its moment. The representative turned its gaze across the chamber, sweeping over every delegation. Any civilization that responds to 47 years of condescension with a speech rather than a weapon is a civilization that this council should welcome, not oppose. The representative sat down. The chamber remained silent for a long time. I sat in my chair and felt something I had not felt in 9 years. Something warm and strange and deeply human. Not triumph, not satisfaction. Something quieter. Relief, maybe. The relief of a held breath finally released. The formal vote came 5 days later. A motion to grant Earth full membership on the Galactic Council. Not provisional membership. Not the junior partnership that the Oravan had offered. Full, permanent membership on the senior conclave, the inner circle of 12 elder species that governed the Council's most critical decisions. I received the notification in my quarters. I read it twice. Then I put on my black uniform, the one with the silver earth on the chest, and I walked to the council chamber for the last time as a passive observer. It would not close again. They were not watching me with condescension. They were watching me with something I had never received from any of them. Respect. Complicated by the memory of how long it had taken them to offer it, and how unnecessary the delay had been. The council speaker directed me to a seat at the central table, not the gallery, not behind glass, the table itself, among the 12 elder species whose representatives governed the galaxy. I sat down. The chair was exactly like every other chair at the table. Nothing special about it, nothing grand or ornamental, just a seat, a place at the table. The Cathali ambassador caught my eye from across the chamber, the one with the iridescent feathers, the one who had told me about their moons, the ones the Draven took 800 years ago and never returned. He was watching me with an expression that I recognized because I had worn it myself, once, standing at a window looking out at the stars. Hope. Cautious, fragile, hard-won hope. The hope of someone who has seen a door open that they thought was sealed forever. The session began. The first item on the agenda was a proposal from the Valley Communion to establish a joint scientific exchange with Earth. They wanted to compare gravitational maps. They wanted to understand deep subspace travel. They wanted to open a channel of communication that went deeper than diplomacy. I accepted on behalf of my government. Geneva had already authorized it. Of course they had. They had been preparing for this moment since before I was born. The ordinary business of a galaxy that was now, for the first time in its history, including humanity in the conversation. I participated. I spoke when it was appropriate. I listened when it was not. I did what I had always done, only now, I was doing it from a seat at the table instead of a chair behind glass. After the session ended, I returned to my quarters. Request permission to stop observing and begin participating. The station's viewport showed the same view it always had. Ships coming and going, running lights tracing patterns against the dark, stars, scattered across the black like points of light on an infinite map. Somewhere out there, 14 human worlds were waking up to a new reality. Somewhere out there, the Helios Dawn was completing its journey with its 2,200 passengers, including 341 children who would grow up on a colony world as full citizens of the Galactic Council. Somewhere out there, a civilization of 8 billion people was learning that the silence was over. I thought about Lucy Grant, who had spent 12 years in this room and filed 11,000 reports without ever raising her voice. I thought about the three observers before her, quiet men and women who had endured the condescension, absorbed the insults, catalogued the laughter, and gone home without complaint. I thought about the people in Geneva whose names I would never know, the ones who had designed this strategy, who had looked at the stars and understood that the galaxy was not ready for humanity, and that the only way to change that was to be patient enough to let the galaxy figure it out on its own terms. I thought about Torvok Sen, who had called us grass-eaters and filed a motion to strip our solar system. He would not forget, and neither would we. I thought about Counselor Yethis, who had offered us a leash wrapped in silk and called it partnership. She was recalculating now, I knew. The Oravan were ancient and proud, but they were also pragmatic. They would adapt. They would approach humanity again, but the next time, the offer would not be kindergarten. It would be something real. I thought about the Veli representative, who had stood up as I walked past, and who had tasted our silence and understood it, who had recognized us for what we were. Not because they were smarter than the other species, but because they were patient too, and patience recognizes patience, the way music recognizes music. And I thought about the question that the Cathali ambassador had asked me, weeks ago, in a corridor, when the galaxy still thought we were nothing. What would you have done differently? The answer, I realized, was nothing. We would have done nothing differently. When you enter a room full of strangers, you do not announce yourself. You do not demand attention. You do not tell them who you are. You watch. You listen. You learn the rules. You map the exits. You figure out who is dangerous, and who is kind, and who is pretending to be one, while being the other. And then, when you understand the room well enough to know exactly what to say, you open your mouth. Not before. We were never silent because we had nothing to say. We were silent because we understood something, that this galaxy, with all its ancient wisdom and 11,000-year history, had somehow never learned. The loudest voice in the room is rarely the most dangerous one. And when they were done, I showed them what we actually were. We are still the species that watched for 47 years before speaking a single word. We are still the people who mapped your stars while you were laughing at us, who built ships your sensors cannot see, who learned your languages before you taught us, who established 14 worlds without making a sound. We chose to speak. That does not mean we have stopped listening. And if you are wise, you will remember that the next time you consider testing our patience. Because we have quite a lot of it. But it is not, as you have now learned, unlimited.